The YouTube Scumbag Bounty Hunter Squad. A Pizzaverse Studios Western parody. When the West went digital, justice needed a new breed of gunslingers. They weren't looking for fame. They weren't chasing clout. They were hunting scumbags one live stream at a time. They call them the YouTube Scumbag Bounty Hunter Squad. Admiral Impeach, the legend. Old school, cold eyes, voice like gravel and bourbon, rides a horse named Algorithm. He don't talk much, but when he does, people get demonetized. Sun-grown trichome, the tracker. Knows every IP in the desert, can smell a fake wise guy through a thumbnail. Always smiling, always high, never misses a shot, except when he's rolling. Jim Martin, the sharpshooter. Quiet type, wears black gloves, black hat, and never runs out of ammo or patience. Once took down a whole comment section with a single post. Aaron, the tech whisperer. Got gadgets, drones, and Wi-Fi boosters strapped to his saddle. If it's online, he can find it and fry it. The crew calls him the firewall with fists. Black Hat music, the enforcer. Every showdown's got its soundtrack and he provides it. Rolls up playing outlaw guitar licks that make the guilty sweat. When the beat drops, somebody's going offline. And then there's David Lopez, the Mexican. A former Fed turned renegade rider. Cool under fire, sharp with a pistol and sharper with his tongue. He don't say much about his past, but when trouble hits, he's the first to draw. They ain't saints. They ain't heroes. But out here, when the scammers start singing and the snakes start biting, they're the only law that's left. Time to clean up this cesspool, boys. Saddle up. The YouTube Scumbag Bounty Hunter Squad. Justice ain't dead, it's just being shadow banned.
Mugged, what the fuck you doing in there, you prick?
Freddy knows, the loudest man in the room. A Palermo Productions documentary. Written by Bambi Palermo. Narrated by Vincent Vinny DiPrio. February 3rd, 1981, 7:15 in the morning. A diner on Rockaway Boulevard, Ozone Park, Queens. 4 FBI agents in 2 unmarked cars are parked outside. Their target is inside eating his 3rd plate of eggs. He arrived at 6:45, moved tables twice before ordering, and has not stopped talking since. The man across from him stopped responding at 7, and is now just staring at his coffee. The agents push through the door, badges out. Ferdinand Deluchia looks up from his eggs, sees the badges, looks at his coffee cup and says, "And." This is documented word for word in the arrest report. I knew it. The waitress has been refilling my cup wrong. That was the tell. They put the cuffs on him mid-sentence. He is still explaining the coffee refill theory as they walk him through the door. One agent later told his supervisor it was the strangest arrest of his career. Not because of the man, because of how completely unsurprised the man seemed, like he'd been waiting for someone to finally arrive and validate his theory. Freddy knows. Ferdinand Freddy Noose Deluchia was not a boss, not a hitter, not a made man, not somebody whose name got said in a quiet voice. He was something that Robert's Lounge in South Ozone Park, Queens, had never seen before and has never fully recovered from describing. He was the guy vibrating at the table. The guy who moved his chair because the angle was bad. The guy who, when Jimmy Burke said, "Collect the envelope," responded with a 14-minute breakdown of why the interest. Structure on that particular account needed to be revisited before any collection could be considered strategically sound. He was right about a third of it. He was exhausting about all of it. And somehow, impossibly, he was one of the most useful people in that room for 15 years. You can't make this up. And here's what gets me every single time I come back to this story. Every mob crew in that era had its terrifying people. It's called calculators. The men who walked through a door and the room adjusted itself around them. The Roberts Lounge crew had Jimmy Burke, who was genuinely one of the most dangerous men in the history of Queens organized crime. It had Tommy D. Simone, who could go from laughing to lethal inside of 30 seconds. And somewhere between those two, moving his chair for the second time that night, explaining to a bartender why the glass shape was acoustically suboptimal, was Freddy. In a world built on violence and silence, he was neither. And somehow that made him indispensable. But here's what makes this genuinely insane. Before Freddy became the unofficial consultant nobody at Roberts Lounge asked for, he was a teenager in South Ozone Park, doing the exact same thing to everybody around him. Before that, a kid on the block who got his nose rearranged at 14 by a man who had simply run out of patience. Before that, a boy who could not stop explaining, analyzing, improving, and revising every single thing he came into contact with. The nickname came from that nose. The nose came from the mouth. And the mouth never stopped, not once, not for 40 years. This is the story of how a man who should have been invisible became the most memorable person in one of the most dangerous criminal operations in New York history. How he found money nobody knew was missing. Built a working front out of 3 vending machines and got hauled into a federal building where he voluntarily drew diagrams of his own operation on government paper. And how it all ended the way it started in a diner with Freddy talking and nobody able to stop him. But here's the question this story keeps raising. In a crew that ended the 1970s with bodies scattered across 3 boroughs and men disappearing without explanation, Freddy Noose was never one of them. And when you understand why, when you get the specific reason Jimmy Burke kept the loudest man in the room alive and employed, you are going to laugh. And then you are going to think about it. And the laugh is going to get complicated. South Ozone Park in the 1950s and 60s was a Queens neighborhood built for men who worked with their hands. It ran along Rockaway Boulevard and pressed up against Aqueduct Racetrack on one side and what would become JFK Airport on the other. Dense streets, tight blocks, the kind of place where everybody's father did something specific for a living. And the men who didn't do something specific did something that the neighbors had learned not to ask about. Nobody got arrested, but one of the men in that car later told someone that he would have taken the arrest over another 15 minutes of Freddy's market analysis. Now, here's what I need you to understand, because the cigarette truck was just money. What Freddy was actually worth showed up 3 months after that job. He came to Jimmy with a ledger, not the one he had been given, his own reconstructed version, which he had spent 37 hours rewriting from memory and calculation. He had found a systematic error in how the crew was calculating collection percentages across the loan sharking book. An error that had been costing the operation $800 a week, every week for 2 years. $83,200 simply gone, evaporated into bad arithmetic that nobody had thought to check, because it was consistent bad arithmetic, and consistent things feel correct. Listen to how Jimmy Burke reacted to this. Jimmy did not say thank you. Jimmy did not say good job. Jimmy looked at the ledger for about 30 seconds and said 2 words, fix it. Freddy, who had prepared a 45-minute presentation on the corrective methodology and the structural reform needed to prevent recurrence, said, yeah, okay, and fixed it in 3 days, because when Jimmy Burke said 2 words, even Freddy understood that the presentation was cancelled. That was his value, not the noise, what was underneath the noise, but that's not even the most interesting part of this era, and I want to tell you about the seafood pitch. Before we move on, because this is where Freddy's genius and his catastrophic optimism lived in the same sentence. It was a slow night at Robert's Lounge in the summer of 1974. Jimmy was at a table. Freddy had already moved his chair once, and Freddy leaned across the table with the specific expression of a man about to change everything. Jimmy, he said, seafood. Nobody tracks seafood. Jimmy looked at him. I'm serious. The Fulton fish market moves 40,000 pounds of Atlantic bluefin in a single week. Nobody monitors the distribution chain past the first transfer. The margin on restaurant-grade tuna is 60% above wholesale. Have a contact at a fish wholesaler in Maspe who owes money. Jimmy said, Freddy, $180,000 in the first quarter alone if we establish 3 dedicated drop points between the market and the restaurant supply chain in mid-Manhattan. Jimmy said, Freddy, silence. Freddy considered. Then he said, what about vending machines in airports? It's passive income. Jimmy put down his coffee. Here's the thing about that moment. Jimmy Burke did not pursue the seafood operation. The man had been in a good mood until that moment. The nose never set quite right after the punch, and from that night forward, the neighborhood had a name for Ferdinand Deluchia. It followed him everywhere he went, including eventually into the most dangerous room in Queens. You have to understand something about how a kid like Freddy ends up in that world. It was not dramatic. There was no moment of decision, no single door he walked through. It was gradual, the way everything in those neighborhoods was gradual. An errand becomes a favor. A favor becomes a reputation. And a reputation in South Ozone Park in the 1960s was the only currency that moved without paperwork. Freddy's first real connection to the organized crime ecosystem in the area came around 1963 through a numbers runner who collected on 101st Avenue. The runner had been through 3 separate conversations with Ferdinand about the inefficiency of his collection route. After the 3rd one, he decided it was less painful to introduce Freddy to someone upstream than to have a 4th conversation. Think about that for a second. Freddy Deluchia talked his way into the mob by telling a numbers runner his logistics were suboptimal. Ferdinand Deluchia was born into this world around 1942, the 2nd son of a family that ran a dry goods shop on 101st Avenue. His father was a patient man. His mother was a patient woman. Where Ferdinand came from, nobody could fully explain. By the time he was 12, the block had developed a consensus about him. Something had been tuned incorrectly when he was assembled. He couldn't sit through a meal without reorganizing the condiments for better access efficiency. He told his 6th grade teacher that her system for assigning homework contained a design flaw and submitted a revised version. He once watched 2 neighborhood boys planning to steal a bicycle and interrupted them halfway through to suggest a more efficient route of escape. One of those boys later said the plan was actually better after Freddy touched it, but the mood was ruined and they just went home. He got his nose broken at 14. Here is exactly how it happened. Here is exactly how it happened. There was a card game on the corner of 102nd Avenue. Regular man playing for pocket money. Nothing serious. Freddy watched for 20 minutes and then walked over and informed the man who was currently winning that he was misreading the betting patterns of the other players and leaving approximately 60 cents per hand on the table.
Hey, you in trouble with the wrong people? Your bookie, your barber, your mother? Come on down to Mikey's Witness Protection Warehouse, where we hide you so good, even you won't find yourself. We got disguises for every situation. You want to vanish like a Vegas debt collector? Boom, we got the Gone in 60 Seconds special. Need a fresh start? We'll hook you up with a fake passport, a new name, and a job at a cannoli stand in Toledo. Frankie Two Forks. I was Frankie Two Forks. Now I'm Larry the Plumber. Nobody suspects nothing, except maybe my accent. All our services come with a lifetime warranty or until the feds catch you, whichever comes first. Big Tony. Hey Mike, what about witness relocation for pets? Tony, no one's looking for your goldfish, all right? Mikey's Witness Protection Warehouse, hide smart, not hard. Call today and mention the code word "forget about it" for a free burner phone and 2 fake IDs. Mikey's Witness Protection Warehouse is not affiliated with the U.S. government, the FBI, or anyone with actual authority. Side effects may include new accents, strange relatives, and sudden urges to start over in Tampa. So don't wait. Disappear today and tell him Mikey sent you. Actually, don't tell him nothing. Mikey's Witness Protection Warehouse. We'll make you a nobody, professionally.
That was the entire audition. That was all of it. By the mid-1960s, Ferdinand had made himself a regular presence at the social clubs and card rooms around South Ozone Park. Not as muscle, not as anyone's designated anything. As the guy who always had an angle, who noticed things, who, if you could get past the noise, usually had something buried in the middle of it that was worth hearing. Here's the thing about that particular quality in that particular world. Most of the men in those rooms wanted clean and simple. The guy who turned every transaction into a graduate seminar was not anyone's favorite person. But the men who actually ran things knew something the others didn't. The loudest voice in the room sometimes had information the quiet voices had missed. Jimmy Burke heard Freddy speak at length for the first time in the autumn of 1967 at a card game at a social club on Lefferts Boulevard. Jimmy had been running a cargo operation out of the airport and had a margin problem he couldn't locate. Freddy, who had been invited by someone as a secondary guest and had already been redirected away from 2 separate conversations that evening for talking too much, spent 40 minutes laying out exactly where the money was leaking and why. Jimmy listened the whole time without expression. At the end, he said one thing to the man who had brought Freddy. He said, "Keep that guy around. Not for his company, for what was in his head." By the early 1970s, Robert's Lounge at 111416 LeForce Boulevard in South Ozone Park had become the operational center of Jimmy Burke's extended network. And Freddy Nonos was a fixture, not at the center, never at the center, but always somewhere in the room, always at a table that had been moved at least once from where he originally sat. Always with something to say. Stay with me here because I want to walk through what Freddy actually did in that crew. Because when people hear the name, they assume he was comic relief. He was not. He was something specific that the operation genuinely needed. And the comedy and the usefulness were the same thing, which is what makes this particular story different from every other mob story. The first major operation Freddy contributed to directly was a cigarette truck job out of JFK in the spring of 1973. The opportunity two cargo staging facilities at the airport ran with reduced staffing specifically between 2 in the morning and 4:30. Nobody had organized around that window yet. The inside connection, a driver with an $11,000 gambling debt, who understood that the arrangement on offer was considerably less painful than the alternative. His job was to drive the truck to a staging area on Rockaway Boulevard, leave the keys in it, go get coffee, and come back to an empty vehicle. The execution: 3 men, 40 minutes, no weapons. A second truck waiting at the 107th Avenue garage in Howard Beach. The money, $47,000 net after the fence, split 4 ways, with Freddy receiving $4,000 as a finder fee for identifying the driver and the debt. The problem. On the drive back, Freddy explained at length to 2 men who had just committed a federal crime that the cigarette market in the tri-state area was fundamentally underdeveloped, that a systematic relationship with vendors could triple their long-term margins, and that he had sketched out a preliminary framework for a 3-year distribution strategy he'd like to walk them through. Nobody got arrested, but one of the men in that car later told someone that he would have taken the arrest over another 15 minutes of Freddy's market analysis. Now, here's what I need you to understand, because the cigarette truck was just money. What Freddy was actually worth showed up 3 months after that job. He came to Jimmy with a ledger, not the one he had been given, his own reconstructed version, which he had spent 37 hours rewriting from memory and calculation. He had found a systematic error in how the crew was calculating collection percentages across the loan sharking book. An error that had been costing the operation $800 a week, every week for 2 years. $83,200 simply gone, evaporated into bad arithmetic that nobody had thought to check, because it was consistent bad arithmetic, and consistent things feel correct. Listen to how Jimmy Burke reacted to this. Jimmy did not say thank you. Jimmy did not say good job. Jimmy looked at the ledger for about 30 seconds and said 2 words: fix it. Freddy, who had prepared a 45-minute presentation on the corrective methodology and the structural reform needed to prevent recurrence, said, yeah, okay, and fixed it in 3 days, because when Jimmy Burke said 2 words, even Freddy understood that the presentation was cancelled. That was his value, not the noise, what was underneath the noise, but that's not even the most interesting part of this era, and I want to tell you about the seafood pitch. Before we move on, because this is where Freddy's genius and his catastrophic optimism lived in the same sentence. It was a slow night at Robert's Lounge in the summer of 1974. Jimmy was at a table. Freddy had already moved his chair once, and Freddy leaned across the table with the specific expression of a man about to change everything. Jimmy, he said, seafood. Nobody tracks seafood. Jimmy looked at him. I'm serious. The Fulton fish market moves 40,000 pounds of Atlantic bluefin in a single week. Nobody monitors the distribution chain past the first transfer. The margin on restaurant-grade tuna is 60% above wholesale. Have a contact at a fish wholesaler in Mass Bay who owes money. Jimmy said, Freddy, $180,000 in the first quarter alone if we establish 3 dedicated drop points between the market and the restaurant supply chain in mid-Manhattan. Jimmy said, Freddy, silence. Freddy considered. Then he said, what about vending machines in airports? It's passive income. Jimmy put down his coffee. Here's the thing about that moment. Jimmy Burke did not pursue the seafood operation. But 3 weeks later, he told Freddy he could put 3 vending machines in the laundromat the crew used on Jamaica Avenue in Wood Haven. 3 machines, not an empire, 3 machines. Freddy took that as a green light for the most intensive legitimate business management in the history of Queens organized crime. He installed 3 units at 481 Jamaica Avenue in Woodhaven in September of 1974. The machines generated $12,000 in legitimate revenue over 6 months. The numbers collection worked, the cash cover worked, and Freddy was there 7 days a week checking inventory, adjusting pricing, field testing, consumer preferences, and explaining to every person who came in to do their laundry why the soda selection had been optimized for peak late afternoon foot traffic patterns. By February of 1975, an FBI operational log contained an entry about a man in a suit visiting a Queens laundromat on a daily basis and appearing to conduct unspecified business. The machine stayed. The daily visits stopped. Freddy lost the only legitimate management role he would ever hold, and he never fully stopped grieving it. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting, and I want to be precise about this, because the next part of this story is where Freddy Nos stops being a funny story and starts being something more complicated. By 1977, the crew had found a kind of working rhythm around Freddy's energy. They had learned to navigate it the way you navigate a specific piece of furniture in a specific room. You know exactly where it is. You know exactly what it does. You work around it, and occasionally it holds you perfectly, and you think, maybe I was wrong about this chair all along, and then it wobbles, and you remember the paranoia had always been part of him. But by the late 1970s, it had developed an internal system with its own rules. You have to hear this because this is real in the way that only completely insane things can be real. Freddy had a jukebox protocol. If Frank Sinatra played twice in one night, Freddy moved to the booth by the back wall, bad angle at the main table. If Sinatra played 3 times, Freddy moved to a standing position near the bathroom hallway. If Frank came on 4 times, Freddy's official position was that Robert's Lounge was compromised for the evening and he would relocate to the diner on Atlantic Avenue to finish his night. The crew had been laughing about this system for 3 years, loudly and consistently. Then came November 14th, 1977, a Tuesday, Sinatra at 9, Sinatra at 10:30, Sinatra at 11:45. By midnight, Freddy is standing near the bathroom, tapping someone's arm and explaining that the jukebox selection pattern is not random, that the bartender's cousin works for the phone company, that the angle of the mirrors above the bar provides a surveillance sight line directly to the card table, and that a vehicle idling on Lefferts Boulevard for the past 6 minutes needs to be noted. The crew is laughing. The bartender is laughing. Somebody starts playing Sinatra a 4th time as a joke. 2 weeks later, in an unrelated federal investigation, court filings disclosed that a wiretap had been operating on the business, 2 doors down from Robert's Lounge since October. Not Robert's Lounge, the neighboring business, but the disclosure covered the entire block and 3 phone calls placed from a public payphone on the corner. A corner that Freddy had specifically identified as having problematic sight lines had been captured in those recordings. Wrong building, wrong method, right block, right corner. The crew stopped laughing about the jukebox system after that. Not entirely, but differently. Get this, that was the beginning of the problem. Because now Freddy's paranoia had a track record, incomplete, inconsistent, wrong more than it was right, but a track record. And in a business where one missed warning equals federal prison, 60% wrong starts looking a lot more interesting when the other 40% keeps hitting. The specific mistake that set the trap in motion happened in early 1978. Freddy had developed a friendship with a man named Vincent, who ran a car service operation out of Richmond Hill. Vincent was calm, pleasant, and most importantly, Vincent never interrupted. To Freddy, a man who never interrupted was essentially a priest. He talked to Vincent about his work the way other men talked about baseball, never names, never specific operations. But Freddy could describe the structural mechanics of how a loan sharking book worked. The interest systems, the collection logic, the client categorization in enough theoretical detail that a trained investigator listening to those conversations would understand the architecture exactly. Vincent had been cooperating with a federal task force investigator since the spring of 1977 on an auto theft inquiry that had nothing to do with the crew. He was a careful listener. He passed everything along. Here's what happens to a man like Freddy when the pressure builds. He does not slow down. He speeds up. The talking accelerates. The chair moves more. The jukebox protocol gains a fifth level he had previously considered excessive. In October of 1978, he spent 6 consecutive hours disassembling a stolen cigarette vending machine down to its individual screws, sorting them by size on the floor of a back room, and then reassembling the machine because he needed, in his own words, to understand its original engineering intent before he could determine whether it had been interfered with. It was a cigarette machine. It had not been interfered with. It was a cigarette machine in a back room in Queens. But Freddy needed to know. December 9th, 1978, the Lufthansa heist. $5,275,000 taken from the cargo terminal at JFK, the biggest single cash robbery in American history at that point. And in the months that followed, the cruise world began eating itself. Men stopped showing up, not because they moved, because they were moved. The calculation had changed overnight, and everyone in that room understood what the new math meant. Freddy knew enough to be scared. He didn't know how to be quiet. By the spring of 1980, it's over. He just doesn't know the shape of it yet. October 16th, 1981, 9 in the morning. The FBI field office at 26 Federal Plaza in Lower Manhattan. Freddy Knows has been brought in on a subpoena connected to a loan sharking inquiry building out of the Eastern District. Not an arrest, a voluntary interview. His attorney sat next to him, reviewed the standard advisements, and told him clearly to say nothing. Freddy shook his attorney's hand, thanked him sincerely, and then spent 4 hours in that room. He did not give up names. He was loyal in that specific way. But what he did was explain in detail and what the investigator's notes described as enthusiastic terms, the theoretical mechanics of how a loan sharking operation structures its interest calculations, manages long-term client relationships, designs payment compliance systems, and distinguishes between clients worth carrying and clients requiring resolution. He drew diagrams on a federal legal pad with the government's pen. He drew diagrams of his own operations' financial architecture and then explained each component while the agents across the table took notes and tried to keep their expressions neutral. One of those agents told a colleague afterward that it was the most informative morning of his entire career in federal law enforcement. He did not mean it as a compliment to the criminal justice system. The charges that followed were relatively limited. One count connected to the loan sharking inquiry, a $5,000 fine probation. Freddy walked out of the federal courthouse on November 22nd, 1981. And the first thing he said to the man waiting on the steps was, the courtroom acoustics were bad. The judge was sitting at the wrong angle for the room. Here's the thing about how this ends. The charges were minor. The diagrams were not. The financial framework Freddy had drawn on government paper was entered as a supporting exhibit in a tax evasion case 18 months later against a business connected to the crew's laundering structure. The connection was indirect. The specific damage was limited, but it closed a door that had taken 15 years to build, and Freddy closed it with a government pen and an office with good lighting while explaining why the math worked. Jimmy Burke was convicted in 1985 on a murder charge connected to the post-Luanza period. He received a life sentence. He died in Greenhaven Correctional Facility in April of 1996. He was 64 years old. The last night Freddy spent at Robert's Lounge. According to two people who were there that night, he moved his table 3 times. He told the vending machine story twice. He pitched a detailed plan for acquiring distribution control over the Rockaway Peninsula seafood supply chain, and he asked the bartender why the Sinatra playlist felt different. The bartender said the jukebox had been restocked. Freddy sat with that information for a long time. Then he moved his chair 1 inch to the left. "The angle's still bad," he said. Nobody argued with him. They never did in the end. Here is what happened to the people around Freddy after Robert's Lounge stopped being what it had been. Henry Hill went into federal witness protection and eventually became the most recognized narrator of that world in American popular culture. He mentioned Ferdinand Deluchia exactly once in his interviews, in a section that did not make it into the published book. He described him as the guy who thought he was running the numbers when really the numbers were running him. Whether that was affection or something else was never entirely clear. Probably both were true. The financial precision that Freddy had brought to that operation evaporated when he left it. The men who rebuilt the loan sharking book after the crew dissolved made the same arithmetic errors he had spent years correcting. That is always what happens when the person who found the problem is gone. The problem comes back. It just comes back to people who don't know it was ever fixed. The laundromat at 481 Jamaica Avenue in Woodhaven eventually became a regular laundromat run by a regular family with no connection to anyone. The vending machines were replaced with better vending machines. Nobody who feeds quarters into them today has any reason to know that a man in a suit once stood in that room 7 days a week, discussing snack consumption psychology with strangers and believing with complete sincerity that he was running a legitimate business empire. Here's what I keep coming back to with this story. Ferdinand Deluchia spent the most productive years of his life in a world that had no category for what he was. He was not violent enough to be feared the way that world required fear. He was not quiet enough to be trusted the way that world required trust. He was not important enough to be protected. He was the man who kept finding money that was not supposed to be findable and then explaining how he found it to people who had stopped listening 3 minutes earlier. In another life, in another room, that brain builds something real, a company, a system, something with his name on it. In this room, in this life, it produced a $5,000 fine and a set of federal diagrams that closed someone else's door. And that is not just Freddy's story. That is the story of a specific type of person who appears in every environment that cannot hold them. The person whose intelligence has no off switch, no appropriate outlet, no room that fits. In organized crime, that type is useful, exhausting, and ultimately replaceable. In legitimate business, that same person is on the cover of a magazine. The only difference is the room they walked into first. The only difference is what the numbers runner on 101st Avenue said to a 14-year-old kid with a freshly broken nose. You can't look at this story and not ask yourself what happens if someone points him somewhere else. Robert's Lounge is gone. The building on Lefferts Boulevard is something else now. But if you know this story, really know it, and you find yourself driving through South Ozone Park, and you pass that address, something happens. You think about a man moving his chair 1 inch to the left at the end of a night that was already over. You think about him drawing diagrams on federal paper and explaining why the math worked. You think about him standing near the bathroom at Robert's Lounge at midnight, telling anyone who would listen that the jukebox was sending signals. And you realize that in a room full of men who were genuinely frightening, the funniest one was also sometimes the most right. And that's a combination so strange and so specific and so completely human that no one who ever sat across from it could entirely forget it. And in the end, let me tell you something, cupcakes. You got killers. You got earners. You got ghosts nobody remembers. And then you got a guy like Freddy. Didn't shut up. Didn't fit in. Didn't play the game right. But somehow, he saw things nobody else saw. And in that world, that's more dangerous than a gun. Because a gun gets you killed fast. A brain like that gets you remembered. If you like stories like this, real ones, deep cuts, the kind of stuff nobody else breaks down, right? You already know where you're at. Subscribe to the Pizzaverse. Hit the bell, don't be a stranger. Drop a comment, tell me, was Freddy a genius or just a guy who never learned when to shut his mouth? And stick around, because next time, we ain't talking about the loudest guy in the room. We're talking about the guys who never said a word and still ran everything. A Pizzaverse Studios production. Palermo Productions. Written by Bambi Palermo. Narrated by Vincent Vinny DePrio.
Tony 911 Pizza Voodoo Doll. When the clowning becomes an emergency. Big old Batman tee stretched across the chest. Silver Maltese cross necklace hanging loud like he stole it from a flea market. Glasses slightly crooked. Hair spiked like he stuck a fork in the outlet. Little stitched mouth shaped like he's about to whine. Comes with tiny pins labeled lies, fake stories, 911, transmission, and con man energy. Tony 911 Pizza Voodoo Doll MobTube Emergency Edition. Tired of hearing bogus stories? Want a little peace and quiet? Give this doll a poke and watch the clownery crumble. Perfect for Pizzaverse citizens, truth seekers, and anyone who ever heard Tony say bro in the middle of a lie. Warning, doll may call the cops on you after repeated use. Ladies and gents, you ever met a man who lies so bad you wish you had a mute button? Well, guess what? We made one. Introducing the Tony 911 Pizza Voodoo Doll. Comes fully equipped with a Batman tee, a Maltese cross necklace, and the ability to disappoint you on command. Order now and get a free bottle of Forget About It oil for when you gotta cleanse your house of fake wise guys.
And I go into that ground. I won't go quietly. I'm bringing my crown. When I go into that ground, oh, they gotta bury me face down. From the rubble, what do I see? There's a whole damn army thinking that they're gonna harm me, saying that I'll never get free. Oh, I got troubles, they won't let me be. But I won't get tired, set the town on fire till my troubles got trouble with me. Thinking that they've won, it's only just begun. When I go into that ground, I won't go quietly. I'm bringing my crown. And when I go into that ground, oh, they gotta bury me face down. I've been on the run since I was a boy, but now I'm done running, got another thing coming. Watch my enemies get destroyed. Oh, I got troubles of more than one kind, but I never sleep. Gotta bury me 6 feet deep where the sun don't shine. Thinking that they've won, it's only just begun. When I go into that ground, I won't go quietly. I'm bringing my crown. And when I go into that ground, oh, they gotta bury me face down. I've been counted out, left for dead, wanted with a bounty on my head. But somehow, someway, I'ma keep moving along. Been counted out, left for dead, wanted with a bounty on my head. But somehow, someway, I'ma keep moving along. Thinking that they've won, it's only just begun. When I go into that ground, I won't go quietly. I'm bringing my crown. And when I go into that ground, oh, they gotta bury me face down. Oh, they gotta bury me face down.